So one of the ways that we create boundaries and a safe container is through our working agreements. And sometimes those are explicit. In this case, I'm hoping to make those explicit, and sometimes they're implicit. And one of the things I talk about with clients in the context of their personal relationships and their working relationships is how important it is to be straightforward about what those expectations are and have a conversation to really establish those working agreements ahead of time. Is what really sets the stage for psychological safety in the context of relationship. And it also creates that path for how you have follow up when things aren't going as smoothly as you planned. You can say, hey, we talked about this as a working agreement. Is that not working anymore, etc. So I am a big believer in modeling and walking the path of what you're preaching. And so that's what we have for today's presentation. So just some of the working agreements that I've outlined, and feel free to add any in the chat if you think we need some to set the stage for this group. One is, while I may be a licensed professional counselor, this is not counseling, it's intended to be more psychoeducation. So with that, we're not entering into a counseling agreement, and that's important to know in terms of confidentiality, right? It's not going to be under the same umbrella as counseling. What you share is shared in this space, particularly if you share during the recording period, because as I previously stated, we're planning to be able to share that. So just keeping that in mind in terms of your vulnerability. The second piece that I'm going to invite everyone to bring, which I invite my attendees at presentations and my clients in counseling, is to bring an adventure mindset. And from my point of view, an adventure mindset is this idea of being open and being willing to risk some level, in this case, of vulnerability or trying something new. And learning, from my point of view, is an adventure or can be an adventure. And we're going to get more from it when we can be curious, when we can be open, when we can allow ourselves to tap into that vitality and childlike wonder. And so I'm going to invite you to do that as we talk about what could be, I guess, a dry topic, which is boundaries, although I think it's quite dynamic. The other piece that I'm going to invite us to consider is to create an environment that's safe enough. And this ties into that adventure mindset. So safe enough in that we've created safety where there can be some sharing, but there's also that space for taking risk. Because as one of my grad school professors often said, growth does not occur in comfort. That we've got to lean into a level of discomfort to really access more potential, to explore areas we haven't explored. And that's my invitation for all of us on this call. The other piece is the pass rules. So I'm going to invite you to consider questions and do activities, just like with the chat, and you can always pass. And again, from my point of view, that's setting good boundaries and limits, which is what this talk is about. So just knowing that you can pass at any time, you can turn your screen off. And then the other piece I have is to take care of yourself, which is also going to continue to come up in this presentation, which is really checking in with the different energy centers we have. So like how we're doing physically, how we're doing mentally, how we're doing emotionally. So if you need to go to the bathroom, obviously do that. Have snacks. I myself have several right here. Water, turn off your screen, etc. And then another piece of creating that safety in that container is presenting to you all what I think the agenda is. Of course, it could evolve and change because there's many of us here on this call. But what I've laid out for us is we're going to begin with a breathing exercise because I find it really important to, with anyone I'm working with, whether it's groups, leaders, individual clients, that it's so helpful to have them transition into this space. Often we're doing so many things before we jump on this call, and that energy, there's a residual element to that. And so I'm going to invite us to really drop in and get present so you can get the most out of learning. We're also going to talk about my perception of what boundaries are, why they're important, some discussion about what types of boundaries, at least as I see it, there are. And that's going to be more general and applying it to you individually in all parts of your life. And then we're going to get more narrow and specific related to business and work and how it applies to that. I'll weave that in, but it's going to go kind of more broadly what boundaries look like in how we care for ourselves and then how we bring that to the workspace. We'll do a guided visualization, talk a little bit more about the benefits of really being intentional and setting limits and boundaries. We might be able to do an activity. It might be something that you take home, but I'll at least outline what it is. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So that is our game plan as it stands. So as I mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and have, oh no, I'm still learning how to work this program. As I shared with Brady, first time using Canva as a presentation. So what I'm going to invite us to do, as I mentioned, is to go ahead and get into the body by taking 3 deep breaths. So you can do that on your own. You can follow my voice. You can turn off your screen if that feels comfortable. And this is going to be an invitation to really get you into your body right now and check in with the present moment right now. And then we'll move forward and you'll be able to learn more in theory from being more embodied in the now. So the type of breath that I'm going to invite us to do is a cleansing breath, which for you yogis that you've probably heard of, or you're going to breathe in through your nose. And I'm going to invite you to have it be a full breath. So you're going to breathe in through your stomach and your ribs and your chest, and then breathe out through your mouth. And if you want to make an audible sound, that can feel really good. And you're just going to allow your body to sink and release anything that you're carrying. So as I mentioned, you can look at this beautiful picture of the river that I took by Lair the Bear, or you can just follow along by closing your eyes. So breathing in, really feeling it be deep, and then breathing out through your mouth. And then we'll do a second breath. So breathing in, allowing your stomach and chest to fill, and then breathing out through your mouth, and allowing the exhale to draw all the way out. And then let's do a third breath, breathing in through your nose, filling your stomach and your ribs and your chest, and allowing that to expand. And then breathing out through your mouth and allowing the exhale to draw out, even being longer than that inhale. So checking in, allowing yourself to feel your body and the breath, and we'll move on into talking about boundaries some more. So I included some quotes from various authors around boundaries, and and Henry Cloud was probably the first author that I remember really doing a deep dive with boundaries that I myself encountered. And some of the points that he outlines that I found really helpful were that boundaries help us determine where we begin and end and where others begin and end. So it really helps us understand what is the internal environment of which we are responsible for and what is the external environment. And we can understand that, I think, to a level physically. It becomes much more messy when we're talking about our emotional and mental and spiritual health. Like when we're talking about those energy centers, it can be a lot more difficult to determine what is my responsibility and part of my internal world and what is the external. And so boundaries help us start to delineate that and be intentional around that. And that kind of ties into another piece from his book of taking responsibility. So he talks about that once we have an ownership of what is ours and what is the rest of the world, we're now responsible for tending to that um, part of ourselves. And that responsibility, while that might seem like more work, in a lot of ways, it gives us freedom because we can tease out, okay, this is what I have ownership of, and the rest I can let go because I don't have ownership of it. And that's really freeing. And it's freeing in the sense of our own lives, but also at work. And I've had a lot of clients tell me about specifically related to work. They're like, well, yes, I hear what you're saying, Melissa, but at my job, they expect me to be responsible for things that I really do not have responsibility for. And then they're like, what am I supposed to do then when, my boss expects me to do these things, but it isn't, I really don't have responsibility for it. I don't have influence for it. What do we do? What do I do with that? And I was like, well, this is when having the conversations is really important. And sometimes it can be difficult because you're like, if you don't feel like you have that space to have that conversation with your supervisor, but you can't leave that job, then I work with my clients of, okay, what can you control? What can you not control? And how do we work within that? So you're not feeling so depleted because you're giving all this energy to things you don't have influence over. So how can you take that ownership back? And part of what boundaries are about is being able to make choices of which we are responsible for. And as Gary Zukav points out in one of his books, a responsible choice is a choice that creates consequences that we're willing to assume responsibility for. So this is really about that intentionality. Boundaries and setting boundaries and limits are about being intentional with our lives. And they're only effective if we hold to them. So I talk again a lot with my clients about whether they're setting boundaries at work or with their kids, that those boundaries and limits are only going to bring them benefit if they can follow through with them. If they can, by holding that boundary, they're willing to accept whatever consequences fall. And sometimes they're not. And then it's like, well, that's not the right boundary for you. As is the example I gave when at work, if your boss is asking you to do something and you're like, well, I don't want to do that, so I'm going to set this boundary. If the consequences that you might get fired and you're not willing to live with that consequence, then maybe that's not the boundary we need to set. So it's a lot about evaluating what kinds of limits are you needing to set, and where you're willing to deal with the consequences of being responsible for that. And I see Andrea on the call. Hey, Andrea. if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat too, and then Bree can pass them on. Another piece that I think is key to think about in terms of boundaries and why I'm starting more generally is that Esther Perel, in this past year, started a podcast about work. And many of you might know Esther Perel. Her area of expertise has really been on affairs in intimate partnerships. And she has another podcast about couples counseling. And now she's bringing her wisdom and understanding about relationships to work, and helping people in their work dynamics. And one of the things she has on her website is that your relational habits don't immediately disappear when you come to the office, meaning who you are at home is going to come to the office, and who you are at the office comes to your house. And this is where I see the connection between when I work with my couples on their connections with each other, it has a ripple effect at work and vice versa. And in a lot of ways, for a lot of people, testing out boundaries and limits can feel less vulnerable and less risky in the work environment because it's not as intimate and as personal. And usually what they're setting limits and boundaries aren't so close to their heart. And so when you're trying to get better at the skill set, finding those environments where there's less risk can be really helpful in building the skill set of holding and following through with boundaries. So that might not be with your supervisor. It could be you start with coworkers of like, okay, like that feels less risky. I can try out setting these limits around my time, meaning I'll tell my coworkers that from 10 a.m. to noon is when I'm working on emails and projects, and that they can call me or email me after that time. That would be an example, right? And that might feel less risky than if you say that to your supervisor. It just depends on the relationship, right? Another aspect that I think is important about boundaries and limits is what Brene Brown brings up, which is when we don't set boundaries, when we don't set limits and hold people accountable, that's when we can feel used and mistreated. And especially in the helping profession, I have seen this in myself and in my clients and in my colleagues of feeling overextended, particularly during this last year. And that's when, from my point of view, boundaries and limits have become even more important than they were before, because our energy is being drawn into other areas of our life, right? Especially like parents who had kids working, doing school at home. That was a whole new demand on their time and energy that they didn't have before. And so boundaries and limits at work became even more important because they had less give. And that's a key component of boundaries, is that there are these, one way to, how I conceptualize it is thinking about these different energy centers that I'm managing, and I'm setting limits and boundaries to help me manage these energy centers. And the first time I was introduced to this concept was from the book, The Power of Full Engagement, which is written by two sports psychologists. And in their book, they talk about initially working with elite athletes, professional athletes, mainly tennis players, and trying to help them increase their performance. And what they found was the exceptional athletes were really good at managing these four centers. So the first four are what they talk about in the book: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And so I'm going to outline a little bit more of what that is, but I'll just give you a little brief history of this. So yeah, they found that these athletes were really good at not necessarily time management, but really managing their energy in an efficient way. And that to be really effective and high performing, it was really about making sure these energy centers were in a nice rhythm with one another. And so they've now since applied the work that they did with athletes to workers. And one of the interesting points they've made in their book is athletes are expected to be high performing for however long their event is. So some events are a few minutes long, some events are like a team sport where they might play for several hours, but that is the entirety of their high level performance that they're expected to meet. Whereas American workers are expected to be high performing all the time. And so what they acknowledge is it's even more difficult to maintain this, and it's even more imperative that workers are aware of managing these energy centers so they don't get burned out. And burnout, from my point of view, has always been pretty high. And particularly after this last year and all those demands I mentioned, the potential for it has gotten increased, I would argue. And I'm seeing more and more of my clients and colleagues who are displaying symptoms of burnout. And a big part of that is, from my point of view, how they're either managing or not managing these energy centers. So I'm going to walk you through them, and then I'll talk about the other two that I added, which is, so physical energy being, how we manage our physical energy throughout the day. It's why I have several beverages and snacks, because I have a high metabolism. So I know I need to be managing that energy center. It's getting enough sleep. It's making sure you exercise, right? Our intellectual energy, or our mental energy, allows us to solve problems, make decisions, think abstractly. So it's a lot of what we use at work. Our emotional energy, our ability to connect with people requires emotional energy, to read a situation. I think a key element of this is Brene Brown pointing out that we are not thinking beings who feel, but feeling beings who think. That feeling is such a huge part of being human. And we don't really invest, from my point of view, a lot in emotional and relational intelligence in schools. We are seeing more of that happen, but a lot of us don't have that skill set and understanding of what it means to manage our emotions throughout the day and check in throughout the day. And that comes at a cost. And one of the biggest costs is burnout. We become emotionally burned out. One of the resources that I've given Bree, a list of resources for you all post this presentation, is the recent book that came out from the Nagoski twins called Burnout. And it's about the stress cycle. And they make the argument that a lot of people are facing burnout in part because of feeling just emotionally exhausted, and that their efforts don't mean anything. And in the powerful engagement, authors say that American workers typically overuse and deplete their energy resources in the emotional and intellectual energy centers, and aren't getting enough in terms of support around their physical health, and also aren't getting enough support around spiritual health. And how they refer to the spiritual center is less about any faith or religion, but more about how we get meaning and purpose in the work we do. And some of you might be aware of Simon Sinek's work around Start With Why, really connecting to mission and vision and how important that is. And that's what these authors also argue, that when we're connected with our mission and purpose in our work and in our lives, we feel more fulfilled, we feel a sense of vitality, and then actually that energy center can feed these other energy centers. Like when we connect with purpose, that can really lift our emotional capacity, can lift our ability to think complexly, and it can motivate us to take care of ourselves physically. So that's how those centers all relate. And boundaries and limits come into play around protecting these energy centers from my point of view. What do you need to, that's why I started off the chat with, what is something you block in your schedule, right? Those, whatever that activity was or priority was likely increases energy in at least one of these centers, and maybe multiple ones. And you've learned that, oh, I got to do this so that I have enough energy to show up, so that I don't burn out. And we're going to continue to revisit this, but I want to just add two more energy centers that I think are important that these authors didn't talk about, but come up in my work. And one is the sexual energy center. So not just in terms of our sexuality, but I'm really getting at the vitality that comes from that energy center, that creativity that comes from that energy center. And when we don't discuss the importance of our sexual energy center, it just goes into shadow. And from my point of view, anything in shadow has the potential to cause us harm, because it can show up in ways that aren't helpful because it's been ignored or suppressed. So I think it's important to realize, like, sexuality is a part of being human. And what does that look like in terms of our work? And how do we integrate that and empower that in a way that's supportive to us and our external environment? And then the last energy center that I have added is the relational energy center, which does involve the emotional, can involve these other energy centers, but from my point of view is its own skill set. And that connection, we know from lots of research, is what can have one of the greatest impacts on our health and well-being, and is so vital, which is why boundaries and limits are so important, because it's a key component to us establishing connection from a place of honoring. I saw a quote that said, boundaries are what allow me to love myself and others at the same time. And so this is why I think relational is its own energy center, because that connection is so important, and why it's important to bring up in a boundaries talk, because that is what's going to help us at work and at home. So that's a lot of talking, and I like doing the activities. So to kind of allow that to integrate, I'm going to have us step into another visualization. This one's going to be longer than the last one. So again, if you want to turn off your screens, you can do that. I'm going to invite us to do a body scan, and then we'll have a second part of the visualization. And if closing your eyes is distracting and that's just not going to serve you, I also have on the screen a video of a stream. Listen to my voice if that feels more supportive. So I'll go ahead and start that and invite you to go ahead and close your eyes if that feels helpful, or allow your eyes to go soft. And as I mentioned, I've been sharing all kinds of things. Maybe your mind's thinking about that or what you were doing before. Right now, I'm going to invite you to be in the present moment and to go ahead and tap into what's going on in the body and really connect with the body's intelligence and that form of data. And just beginning by tuning into the breath. So noticing your inhale, noticing your exhale. No need to control that. Just observe what's showing up. And then I'm going to invite you to bring your awareness to the top of your head and noticing any sensation that might arise. And again, not controlling anything, just tending and befriending what decides to show up as you bring your awareness to it. And then allowing your awareness to fall to the front of your face, noticing any sensation in your brow or your jaw. Bringing your awareness to the back of the head and neck. Bringing awareness to your throat, noticing how it has experienced the day and any sensation that might be there. Allowing your awareness to go to your shoulders, down your arms, and bringing each one of your fingertips into your awareness. And then returning to the chest and tapping into the rhythm of your heart, noticing if you can feel that rhythm. And then continuing along to your ribs, which protect your lungs, and noticing any sensation there. Bringing awareness to your stomach, digestive system, to your pelvic bowl, which carries all your major organs. Noticing the back of the body, from the neck all the way down the spine to your hips and glutes. And then allowing your awareness to continue down your legs to your feet. And holding your whole body in your awareness. Noticing sensation as it moves. Anything that feels neutral. Just observing what is present. Then, as you have a clear snapshot of what the body is experiencing right now, I want you to imagine some sort of bubble. It could be an actual bubble. It could be a force field. It could be, as one of my clients said, a cone of silence that's surrounding you. And it is a protective sphere that surrounds your entire body. Notice if it's a particular color. Notice if it's a particular material. Just imagine this sphere protecting and encompassing all of you. And then I invite you to notice, how does the body respond to having this protective sphere? What sensation moves? What stays still? And then think about a situation that happened in the last 48 to 72 hours where somebody might have said or did something and it didn't feel helpful. Perhaps it brought out a reaction to you. And allow that situation to come towards you and notice that it doesn't quite penetrate the bubble. It just hits the sphere and falls to the ground. And notice what it's like to have this sphere that lets in what is serving, what brings wellness, what feels supportive, and keeps out what does not. And just play with that. What is that like interacting with the environment when you have this protective sphere, this sphere that encompasses these different energy centers? And also notice when you send out into the world, it filters through this sphere, and only what serves and is supportive and brings wellness goes out into the world. So the sphere has a two-way flow of letting in what is serving and supportive, keeping out what does not, and also letting out into the world what is supportive, what raises consciousness, and keeping out what does not. And just notice in this visualization how the body responds, how the heart responds, how your mind responds. And once you have a nice sense of that, knowing you can return to that or access that at any time, I invite you to take a few more deep breaths, and we will continue with the presentation. So as you guys come to, feel free to turn on your screens or not, and transition back into the space. So that visualization was intended to help you just tap into a way to visualize your protective boundary. I have a client, the same one I mentioned, that visualizes this energy field before she goes in to meet with difficult clients or have a difficult conversation with the employee, because she's bringing that intention, right, of only letting in what's going to serve her, help her be a better person, keep out what does not, and vice versa, right? The other intention is that she only wants to put out what is going to serve the external and keep in, maybe she wants to say F you, but she's going to keep that in because that doesn't serve the group. So that's just one way to visualize and be intentional. It's one of the strategies I myself use in working with clients of how do I protect my own energy source so that I can be my best self when I work with clients. And that's a huge piece of setting boundaries, specifically at work, is that when we do that, we can show up as our best selves. We're going to be more creative. We're going to be more innovative because we're protecting those energy centers and we're being intentional about that. And that gives us a greater sense of freedom and empowerment when we feel like we can make choices. When we're able to create that containment as well, and really create that protective environment within the context of teams do better because they feel like they can be vulnerable. They feel like they can take risks. The other piece that's so key about managing those energy centers at work is it can create a manageable rhythm for our workday. So one of the things I talk with my clients about is to set the goal, not that this is going to happen every day, but to set the goal of beginning and ending their day with roughly the same amount of energy. And so what are the things they're going to do throughout the day that help replenish their energy so that they can end the day just as stoked as they began the day? And if they start the day depleted, then what are they going to need to put in their day so that they can actually raise their energy and show up in the ways that they want to show up. And you can talk about this in terms of teams. What do we need to do as a team to really help support managing the energy of this team and really access creativity? What are the habits we need to do? Do we need to do, another client told me that their team at work started doing meditations for the first 5 minutes before they have a meeting so that they could be present and get more out of the meeting. And they just decided that that was how they were going to be more productive. And when we do these things, when we build these habits, it reduces our burnout, both individually and collectively. It also increases our potential for enjoying our work, which Sean Acker has done a lot of research about the advantage of happy workers. We're more productive. We tend to be more loyal to the work of our organization and more willing to make sacrifices on behalf of the team because we feel like, you know, the company organization has our back. So we're willing to do that as well. And so there's so much that companies and organizations benefit from teaching their employees and encouraging their employees to set these boundaries and limits, because then you're going to have happy workers lead to happy customers, which lead to greater success outcomes, right? Another component of setting boundaries and limits is that psychological safety helps us in terms of strategic implementation, because we can get everyone on the same page when everyone feels like they're supported and their opinion matters, and their wellness matters. So this was going to be my activity, which I don't think we have done, but I'm going to outline it and you can do this on your own. This comes from a TED Talk that I think it's called The Magic Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Hopefully my French, as I said, doesn't offend you. And it's a way to visualize and actually write a plan on your cares, on your energy. So in the TED Talk, the woman talks about like creating a budget for the things she's going to allocate her fucks or her cares for, and to be intentional about it and not just willy-nilly give them out. And I had a client who I presented this concept to that was like, Melissa, I think I've been operating on IOUs this whole time. And I was like, yes, that happens when we just give our cares out, right? We give our energy out, then we're depleted and we're just having to give out IOUs. And this is about taking ownership and really being able to come from an empowered place. So, you know, things to consider when you're creating this budget is how many cares do you start the day with? And that ties into our energy centers. What are your top task priorities? Like, where are you going to give your cares to these tasks? What are your top relationship priorities? Because those are, you know, two different things that you might be considering. What are things or people that tend to take away from your cares that actually you don't want to prioritize? And how are you going to set limits to keep those people or activities from drawing and taking away from your buck bucks, so to speak? Other things that I think are important to consider are activities that are a requirement, like you have to do them, and things that are extras. So setting up your budget for the day or the week based off that, right? Like, I got to get these things done, so my bucks got to go to that. But with these extra dollars, I can spend them however I want. Another thing that I have my clients consider is the return on investment, meaning if it takes $2 to do this activity, but they get $4 back in terms of the energy that that they get from, let's say, one of my clients gardens around the noon hour, because they know that gives them more bucks, right? So it takes them $2 to get out to the garden, but when they come back in, they have $4, right? That's a pretty good ROI. So thinking about what is the return of investment on the activity and putting that in your schedule so that you can manage your energy. Another thing that they talked about in the power of full engagement was blocking your schedule. So I gave an example of that, like blocking out your time to do email. So not doing email throughout the day, but like being like, okay, I know that from 10 to 11, I have a chunk of time that would be a great time to get back to email. And that is when I'm going to respond to emails, and I'm going to train my coworkers and my colleagues to know that that's what I'm going to set that expectation, and I'm going to train them by them seeing that that's when I respond. That's such a big piece of, I have on here, Have Your Garden Weed Itself, that comes from Think Like a Freak, which are the authors of Freakonomics. And they talk about setting up systems that allow the garden to basically take care of itself. So an example of that is for myself, like I don't like being available on the weekends, and I usually am not available. I'm usually up in the mountains, so my clients can get a hold of me even if they want to. So it's very clear from the get-go that I'm not available on weekends. And so clients that need counselors that are available on weekends don't come see me. That's an example of having your garden weed itself, because you put out this information of what type of client you're seeking, or what type of partnership are you hoping for collaboration. And then you're only going to get back people that match that criteria. That's less work for you, and you're going to have a more successful partnership. So you're already putting out there what the limits and boundaries are. And that allows you to have more successful collaborations, and also you put in a little work on the front end, but saves you time on the back end. And I think we're going to go ahead and skip this this activity because we're out of time and I want to get to the Q&A. So we'll go ahead and continue on. So just some thoughts of kind of wrapping up what we talked about, at least what I wanted to share with you, which is that boundaries really help us determine where we begin and end, and where others begin and end. It also allows us to determine what we want to be responsible for and how we want to allocate our cares or our bucks, as I mentioned. It helps us manage our energy centers so we're not depleted and feeling burned out, because that's the worst when you're pursuing work that you love, and because you don't have limits and boundaries in place, or because your team doesn't have limits and boundaries, you all get burned out, and then you're not excited about the work, and you're more likely to get sick, and it just has this ripple effect. It has a negative impact on your relationships. So when we set these boundaries and limits, it can be uncomfortable, as Brene Brown talks about. 5 minutes of discomfort might save us 5 months of resentment, because we're not going to agree to something that we don't want to agree to, right? We might have an uncomfortable conversation, but at least then we didn't allocate our bucks in a way we didn't want to. So it really is about taking back our lives and responsibility, and living from a more empowered place. Boundaries and limits also help create safety in teams, which, as I mentioned, is necessary for action to actually take place in an effective way, because you get everybody aligned moving towards that goal. And then the last piece, as I mentioned already, is when you feel energized, you're going to be more innovative, more creative, more stoked, and more resilient for things like what unfolded in the last year, right? I found for myself that I already was very protective of my boundaries, because I've been burned out before and learned my lesson the hard way. And so this year, I was even having to be more on top of self-care, more on top of these habits, more intentional with conversations, because I had less bucks to give to certain things. So I had to be more intentional. And that is it. So that's some of my contact information, and we'll open it up to Q&A. Bree, if you'll stop the recording, or comment.